Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Poles and Bohemians stats from online ranked games. There's been some debate about whether or not they're overpowered, and we'll see if we can settle that. The two civs were released a couple of months ago now, so there's enough data at this point to draw some tentative conclusions, with hard numbers to back it up. The site made by Jerbot that I usually get stats from isn't updated with the new civs just yet, but there's another site by Coolio9876 which uses a similar method of sorting data. Just a couple of things to know before we get into the numbers. Everything we'll see is using 1200 ELO and higher for 1v1 games and 2000 rating or higher for team games. Both are roughly the cutoff for the top 25% of players, so leaning more on the competitive side but not focused solely on expert level games. The first 2 weeks of games after the expansion came out also aren't included to give players a bit of time to figure out the new civs. We'll start out with my preferred of the two, the Poles. Now, I really enjoy playing with this civ. The Folwark is an interesting building. I like getting gold while mining stone and how much that helps get an early castle. The Obu trades really well against most melee units, and their discounted knight spam I thought could make them one of the best pocket civs on Arabia. It turns out over the last month and a half, across all maps, they were the 15th most played civilization, similar to Chinese and Spanish. Just in case it isn't clear from the chart, civs on the left side are the most played and the ones on the right are the least played. Now, Poles being 15th most popular isn't all that bad, considering not everyone buys the expansion. But as for my prediction that Poles would be a really strong civ, it didn't quite work out that way. So far, by win rate, they've ended up being 12th overall if you average across all maps, 1v1s, and team games, with a little over a 50% win rate. Again, this is sorted with the best civs on the left and the worst on the right, with some error bars to show this isn't an exact science. The bars essentially mean if we let millions of games be played out, we're 95% sure the win rate would settle somewhere within that range. The Poles being a little above average is consistent across skill levels as well, and in games between everyone from 900 ELO to 1600, it seems reasonable to say that Poles are average or maybe a little better. This isn't the full story though, as it's combining the results on all maps, so let's get a bit more nuanced and look just at 1v1 Arabia games for roughly the top 25% of players. It turns out they're not that great. There's a lot of civilizations bunched up in the middle, but so far they're 23rd out of 39 civs with a 49% win rate. To me, that's a little surprising given how strong they seem on paper with extra gold and their discounted knights. Digging a bit deeper, it's pretty obvious what's going on though. This chart shows their win rate for games of different lengths, with their win rate in short games on the left and longer games on the right. Of games that end between 20 and 30 minutes, you can see they're losing up to 2/3 of the time. What that tells me is they're not keeping up in feudal age, and a lot of players with Poles are resigning at 20 or 25 minutes because they've fallen too far behind. Contrast that with Mongols or Lithuanians, who have a very strong scout rush and are more often able to end the game quickly. One factor that could be working against the Poles here is the Folwark is a little more expensive than the mill and leaves your farmers potentially more exposed than farming around a town center. Players taking the gamble of forward farmers could be losing villagers more often and feel they can't come back from that. On the flip side, once the game starts to last 35 or 40 minutes, then Poles are actually above average, probably helped out a lot by their cheap knights or winged hussars. A really interesting feature on the site that I'm using is it also groups civilizations based on their tendency to win or lose against similar civs. If we look at the comparable civ to Poles, we see Spanish are the closest, which makes quite a bit of sense. They'd have similar good and bad matchups, as both are cavalry civs that are slow out of the gate and become dangerous in Castle Age. This was all just for 1v1 Arabia though, and now let's take a look at Arabia team games. The most common meta for 3v3 or 4v4 is archer civs on the flanks and knight civs backing them up. Similarly, in 2v2, you often have a knight and an archer civ so that your units will protect from the other's counters. The most popular cavalry picks are Franks and Magyars, and for archers, the most common are Britons, Mayans, and Ethiopians, in that order. On paper, Poles would nicely fit the knight civ role, with an early food bonus for scouts and then later discounted knights. It seems that people are trying to do that, as Poles are picked the 11th most often, similar to Persians, Cumans, and Vikings. Now, before I show you the win rate, keep in mind it's sort of tricky in team games, and they have large error bars since it's hard to isolate just one civ's contribution in, say, a 4v4. You need a ton of games to really draw any strong conclusions, so just take all of this with a grain of salt. What we see though is similar to 1v1, Poles are average to slightly below average in Arabia team games. This is true pretty much across the board, regardless of game length or team game rating. This was all a little surprising to me, as I would have thought Poles would do quite well, especially in early Imperial Age with their Cavalier spam, but that just doesn't seem to be how it's working out in practice. I think the lack of Paladin is probably holding them back, as well as the lack of a really strong early game bonus. That's just for open maps though, and now let's take a look at how they do in closed maps, where they have more of a chance to boom. We'll start with 1 vs 1s, where 82% of the data is coming from Arena and 18% is from the map Hideout. It turns out in this case, Poles are a pretty popular pick, so people are at least thinking that they'll be good. On Arena, the lack of a strong early game bonus is less important, so you'd probably expect Poles to be a little better here, though Cavalry Civs overall tend to do a little worse on Arena, so that's working against them. If we look at the win rates though, it turns out Poles are the best Arena Civ. Crazy, right? With over a 57% win rate. For context, Franks are the best 1v1 Arabia Civ and are called overpowered all the time, and yet only have a 54% win rate, so this is pretty remarkable. The narrative was Bohemians were supposed to be the Arena Civ, and peeking ahead, you can see Bohemians are also very good at 5th overall. Keep in mind, Poles and Bohemians' 95% confidence intervals overlap somewhat, so given enough time, it's possible they'd settle pretty close together. I still think this tells us a lot about the Poles and their strengths and weaknesses. As soon as you give them starting walls, they're immediately top tier. I think that's partly due to the gold while mining stone, which lets you go on stone earlier and be the first to build a castle, and it's also much easier to survive until they reach their discounted knights. You can see they have a big spike in win rate in games lasting 35 to 40 minutes, which they win about 2/3 of. At this skill level, that coincides with late Castle Age and early Imperial, and I expect quite a few resignations happen just after Poles hit Imperial Age and turn their army of knights into cavaliers. Interestingly, they seem to drop off if the game goes on for too long, so their winged hussars don't seem to be a big help, or at least don't make up entirely for missing halberdier. In case you're wondering, if anything, their success also seems to improve at higher elo ratings. The team game data is also quite similar, with Poles being the 7th most popular pick on Arena and having the 2nd highest win rate, basically tied with Cumans for the top spot. Again, the error bars show how difficult it is to isolate just one civ on a team, and we also only have a month and a half of games, so I wouldn't read too much into it, but it's consistent with the 1v1 data and there's no question they're above average. Overall, for Poles, the stats so far are painting a picture of a relatively average civ on open maps that's losing a lot of games in feudal or early Castle Age, despite some extra food from farms and self-healing villagers. Closed maps are a completely different story though. Between their full work powered boom, early castles, and night spam, they're a top tier, if not the best closed map civ over the last month or so. Now, we've already kind of touched on them a bit so far, but let's switch now and deep dive into the numbers for the Bohemians. Up front, I have to say subjectively, Bohemians have felt much more difficult to play. Initially, they feel like an archer civ with free gold mining and a cheap blacksmith, but their transition into the late game pulls you in a lot of different directions. You have crossbows with chemistry, but end up missing thumbring, and you need to think about when to add hussite wagons, whether monks costing only food are worth adding in, and how much emphasis to put on bombard cannons. Their hand cannoneers move faster as well, but then their halberdiers also do more damage to cavalry. It's a lot to think about. With all that said, across every map, 1v1s and team games, Bohemians are picked 23rd out of 39 civs, so a little below average, but not terrible. For win rate, again, across all maps, they're 25th, though there's a lot of civs that perform similarly, and you can see a ton of overlap in all of their error bars. If we change the focus from all maps to just 1v1 Arabia, Bohemians rank pretty close to the bottom, roughly on par with Spanish and Turks. That's true across all elo ratings, and the story is quite similar to the Poles. They do terribly in short games, where presumably they're losing to strong aggression and unable to capitalize on weak civs, and their Castle Age in general seems fairly weak as well. Though, like Poles, if they can hang on long enough, they can end up doing okay. I think again that comes down to lacking a Dark Age eco bonus and just never getting a solid footing. A bit of extra gold income and a 100 wood discount on a blacksmith sounds strong on paper for archers, who cost wood and gold, but for whatever reason that isn't translating into good results. It reminds me a bit of Portuguese, who have a gold discount, which you'd think would be helpful for archers, but they're also quite weak in feudal. One possible takeaway is that maybe gold bonuses just don't help that much in the early to mid game. If we switch our focus to Arabia team games, we need the same disclaimer about sample size and how hard it is to capture the contribution of a single civ to the team. But again, we still see a hint that Bohemians are not a great pick on Arabia, for probably the same reasons that they aren't a good pick in 1v1. But now let's talk about the closed maps, Arena and Hideout. This is where Bohemians were supposed to shine, and are in fact the 2nd most popular pick, despite not everyone owning the newest expansion. On paper, they sound perfect for Arena. You get early chemistry, tons of gunpowder options, plus faster and tougher villagers in the late game. Of course, as we already saw, they end up being quite strong, but not as broken as was predicted. Funny enough, it actually ends up being the shorter games lasting under 30 minutes where they seem to do the best. It could be the chemistry on their crossbows helps close out games in late Castle Age, and the 100 wood off their monasteries is also nice for picking up relics. The free stone mining upgrade also helps them do a castle drop first, which is a great way to apply pressure and catch someone off guard. With arena team games, they're picked a little less often, but still the 6th most popular, and again we see them near the front of the pack when it comes to win rate. Technically, Poles are still a little ahead, but Bohemians can't be considered a bad pick by any means. So to wrap up, it's interesting that both civs are average to below average on open maps and top tier on closed maps. Going by the results so far, it seems Poles are the stronger civ of the two, though it could also be that they're a bit easier for players to pick up, and Bohemians will just take a bit more time for players to figure out. Now that I've seen the numbers, it makes quite a bit of sense to me why in the last patch they didn't have any changes for either civ, though I suspect something about the Poles is going to be nerfed down the road if they keep dominating on arena by so much. Unfortunately, without major changes, I don't think either will ultimately be a very good Arabia civ, though the balance was pretty good for just taking a shot in the dark on release. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.